Welcome back, PetaPixel viewers. It is Chris Nichols here, and we are in the middle of an Arctic freeze. Western Canada has been getting hit by minus 40, minus 45. I mean, really bad temperatures. It's a beautiful day today. The sun's shining, but it is still incredibly cold. But the show must go on, and we need to talk about the Sony A9 III. Okay, well, so we've already covered the Sony A9 III intro. We did that in New York City. You should definitely check out that video because that's where we talk about handling and features and stuff. What we really want to focus on today, God, it's cold, is we want to focus on the compromises and the caveats to having this camera with a global sensor, because yes, global sensors can unleash a lot of interesting features, but they do come with a lot of issues, and that's what we want to cover for you guys today. And it's freezing cold. Medical professionals say we should not be outside right now, so let's get inside the Calgary Farmers Market. Now, in our previous video, we talked a lot about the handling on the A9 III. I don't want to go too far into that, but having now used it more, had more time with the camera, there's some points that I really am enjoying that I want to mention. This really is the best handling Sony full-frame mirrorless camera to date. I mean, I really like the new grip, all the extra controls. I love that we have this customizable button under the grip. That's been really handy. My only complaint is still that we don't have the same locking mechanism on the mode dial and this command dial, but otherwise, the camera handles beautifully and the grip is much improved. We also get that excellent screen with the full articulation that we really like from the Sony a7R5. Now, while we're on the topic of displays, I love the over 9 million dot EVF, but especially on this camera, because in previous cameras, we've seen this EVF before, but you get a resolution drop when you started focusing, shooting fast action and sports, so you weren't really getting the benefits of all of those dots. Only in playback did you really see the enhanced resolution of that EVF. But on this camera, there's now really no compromise. I mean, I can shoot up to 120 frames per second, no resolution drop. And so now we're really finally seeing the actual potential benefits of having such a high resolution EVF like this. I could go up to 240 frames per second, then I have a bit of a resolution drop, but I'm not playing Call of Duty on this thing. Now, what the Sony A9 III can do very well is perform as a sports and action camera, because the global shutter unlocks not only insanely fast shutter speeds, but also more importantly, very high burst rates. So right now, currently, the camera's capped at 16 thousandths of a second. If you're shooting continuous bursts, you can go up to 80 thousandths of a second if you want to do single shots. But I mean, 16 thousandths is still plenty, and that will be unlocked in the future. But more importantly, this camera can shoot 120 frames per second burst rates, and that's without any slowdown. There's no lack of autofocus, nothing like that. The camera functions exactly the same. And so for sports and action, wildlife, if you're trying to capture that decisive moment, this is going to be the one to go to. I know a lot of you are going to say, oh, I don't need 120 frames per second to capture the majesty that I get. I'm the greatest photographer ever. But what's beautiful here is I can use that boost function, dedicate one of these custom buttons to the boost function mode. That way I can shoot at far more moderate frames per second rates. And then when I need that 120 frames per second, touch the boost button, keep shooting, and I just get that for a short period of time, so I don't have a whole bunch of photos to wade through. Now, the Sony A9 III does use a very similar card setup to what we've seen on other Sony cameras. You get dual CF Express Type A cards or dual SD, and it is a nice flexible port system, although CF Express A, so far, it's really just Sony that's using it. Now, if you are going to shoot high burst rates, I do recommend investing in those CF Express Type A cards. They will give you faster throughput, but what is quite odd on this camera is, to date so far, it doesn't support the latest CF Express protocols. It doesn't support 4.0, and that does seem very strange given how fast this camera is and what it's aimed at shooting, sports, action, and wildlife. So hopefully we'll see this update in future firmware updates. Now, it might be bright and sunny outside, but while we're indoors here where it's warm, it is, of course, a little bit darker. So we want to talk about low light performance next on this sensor. Now, when we were in New York City testing the pre-production A9 III, we were absolutely impressed by how good the JPEGs were as far as noise goes, especially at high ISO. But it turns out that's because we could only look at the JPEGs, we couldn't edit the RAWs, and Sony's actually applying quite a bit of noise reduction to those JPEG files. That makes sense. When you look at the RAW files, it's a different story. I mean, this camera does have some compromises because of this global shutter. So now that we can all look at the RAW files and really evaluate them, what we and pretty much everybody else are finding is this camera's low light performance, ISO performance, just isn't as good as a contemporary full frame camera from today, despite the fact this has a very high price tag. So basically how this is going to turn out, and an easy way to think about this is going to give you low light performance very similar to a modern APS-C camera, like a Sony a6700, for example. So that's not to say that that's bad. I'm perfectly comfortable shooting in a low light situation like this, but if I want the absolute best performance when it comes to low light shooting and ISO noise quality, this is not the camera to get. So we found this particularly contrasting situation, i.e. Jordan says ugly situation, because we want to talk about dynamic range next on the Sony A9 III. The fact of the matter is global shutters do have a serious downside in that they don't just collect or absorb as much light as a conventional sensor would. This is reflected on the A9 III having a base ISO of 250 when other cameras would have 100 or even 64. If you were to shoot this and a contemporary full-frame camera both at ISO 250, yeah, you would get a similar looking file, but when those other cameras can then go down to lower base ISOs, the shadow floor is going to be much cleaner, you can push them much further, and the A9 III is just not capable of doing that. So not only do we have poorer low light performance, but also the ability to push and pull shadows and highlights is also diminished. And again, just to give you guys more context here, it's going to be very similar roughly to if you were shooting an APS-C camera as far as dynamic range goes. So you just got to feel like the global shutter is one step forward in some places and one step back in others. Now, when it comes to autofocus, you know that we love Sony's real-time autofocus. I still think it's probably one of the highest hit rates that you'll get on any mirrorless camera today. When we were in New York City, we got to shoot professional athletes. That was really fun. The hit rate was excellent, always on the eyes. I mean, it did a great job. But we didn't do any full 120 frame per second bursts for extended times because we wanted to save that not only for production camera, but the greatest athlete of all. That's Jordan Drake running outside in the winter cold. So here you can see again, beautifully done, captures his eye, the hit rate is excellent. I mean, if I was going to shoot any sort of fast, demanding photography, I think the Sony A9 III would be the most confidence-inspiring as far as getting the best hit rate. But we also didn't get a chance to shoot any wildlife. So one of our editors, Jeremy Gray, he's got a beautiful, adorable dog named Evie, and he took her out and shot here 120 frames per second in wildlife detect mode. And again, you can see the hit rate is excellent, beautiful shots, does a great job, and dogs can be very difficult to shoot and very unpredictable. And so it just brings me to the conclusion that if you're looking for a great autofocusing experience, a camera that's going to give you the best hit rate, Sony's have already been the highest on our list, and this is the best Sony I've used to date. So I would really say one of the big advantages of getting a Sony A9 III is you're going to get pretty much the best autofocusing mirrorless camera right now on the market. Okay, let's talk about flash next on the Sony A9 III because there are some interesting benefits, but there's also some quirks to keep in mind. We went to the event in New York City. We were shooting sports and action indoors with high-powered strobes. Now, here's a situation where you can shoot faster shutter speeds to freeze any sort of movement that the flash isn't reaching, maybe other movement in the background, stuff like that. Now, when we were in New York City shooting, of course, there's technicians there. The flashes were already set up. They knew what wireless triggers they were using, and so we could absolutely match our cameras to those flash scenarios. But here's the trick. As you get into faster and faster shutter speeds, you start to run into an issue. The flash durations can be quite fast, and then the shutter speeds themselves are very short periods of time. And if the two don't line up, where the flash fires but the shutter's not recording light, you're going to get ambient exposure, but you're not going to get any flash showing up. So there's a fix for this. You can go into the menu and adjust the flash timing, basically adjust the latency until the flash and the shutter speed line up at the same time. But this is a variable thing. It's going to depend on what flashes you're using, what power output, if you have soft boxes or not, what wireless triggers you're using, what are the brands. I mean, you really do have to tweak it every single time. But what about when we want to go outside on a bright sunny day, shoot very high speed shutter speeds, but also try to get the flash to sync properly? Well, it's freezing cold, but we're going to do this for you. Let's go try it. Okay, so we got to get this portrait out here with flash. It's bitterly cold, but I mean, Jordan's miserable. But you know, the sun's out. It's actually warmed up to about minus 32 Celsius. That's not bad, right, Jordan? Yeah, that's before the wind, and there's a bit of a blowing wind here. But I wanted to go with the Westcott FJ400 because if I'm gonna, fool around with the settings here on the A9 III and really try to dial it in, plus out-compete with that sun right behind him, I want the most output possible, especially with the softbox, so it always does a good job there. And I don't know, I may have mentioned how bitterly cold it is, but we got the battery-powered FJ400, the battery-powered FJ-X3 transmitter, and even though we've been out here for way too long, they've been going strong, they've been really reliable in these conditions. So that's why Westcott is our preferred lighting partner here at PetaPixel. So I guess I should get the shot of Jordan before he dies. Okay, so we're back in the car now because it's just pure hell out there. But we got some nice shots, Jordan, and let's talk about the progression of how that happened and just really what's kind of going on here. So, first off, I think what a lot of people misconstrue about flashes is that when you turn the intensity up, that you're making the flash stronger, and when you turn it down, you're making the flash weaker. But what you're actually doing is making the flash longer when you turn it up in intensity and making the flash shorter when you turn it down. I mean, it's a matter of length. The longer the time, the more light, the stronger the output from the flash. So When we're using a global shutter, the beautiful thing about this is we don't have any flash sync issues. So I can basically use whatever shutter speed I want to, and that flash will sync with it properly. However, we now run into an issue that we never run into on conventional cameras, and that is what happens if the shutter speed on my camera is shorter than the duration of the flash? Well, then the problem there is the flash isn't going to give its full output because the shutter speed itself is only taking a portion of that time of that flash. So let's talk about the issues that we're going to have to deal with on this particular camera when having to use flashes at these high shutter speeds. So first off, we got a beautiful, bright, sunny day. I'm trying to outcompete the sun, but get that rim lighting around Jordan's furry collar there and still get nice exposure on his face. So first thing I've done here, I've got the flash turned up to maximum. I'm shooting f4. The minimum ISO on this camera is 250th, so I'm getting more ambient exposure that I want to get rid of, but I am also getting more output out of the flash because of that higher ISO. And so what I started at is 4,000th of a second. This is something you would never be able to shoot on a conventional mechanical shutter. And at 4,000th of a second, it's syncing properly. In fact, the flash is a little bit too bright. Rather than turn the flash down though, I'm actually going to go up into faster shutter speed. So as I go up to 8,000th of a second and then up to 16,000th of a second, what you're seeing is just that the output of the flash is starting to drop a little bit. And that's because my shutter speeds aren't making use of the full duration of that flash. That's okay. I want the exposure to come down, the ambient light's going down. I can go even further, go up to 32,000th of a second, go up to 64,000th of a second. And as we go higher, what you see is just the flash output just starts to drop more and more, but so does the ambient. Again, I've got this flash cranked to the max. I can't go any further with it. One other issue that you're going to find then is you're also going to find that the flash delay might have that flash duration missing some of the shutter speed exposure. I mean, I might be all the way off the end of it or all the way off the start of it. And so in the Sony A9 III, I've got a menu where I can tweak that timing back and forth. Honestly, this is really going to be a lot of trial and error. And you can see here what I finally settled on. 51,200th of a second was my shutter speed. I like the background. I'm getting good flash output. It's weaker than what the flash would normally give, but I can work with it here. And so now what I was finding is tweaking my flash timing. If I went too far in one direction, you can see the exposure drops off, eventually just going completely black. Then I go back and it starts to rise up again to a peak where I'm getting optimum exposure. I go too far the other way, it starts to drop again. So you kind of have to just guess and test, go back and forth so you're getting maximum output out of your flash. I did finally get there. So I know this all sounds complicated, but let's just talk about the advantages that we have here. So if I was using a conventional mechanical shutter speed, normally I'd be maxed out at about 250th of a second with flashes, barring any sort of high-speed sync, which drops your output in a huge way. So outcompeting in the sun like this, I would use a 3 or 4 stop ND filter to cut a lot of that ambient light and then hope that my flash output can overcome that ND filter. As well, using ND filters, it tends to slow down your camera's autofocus performance and stuff like that because you're blocking light to the sensor. Now on the A9 III, we do have an advantage. I mean, first off, I don't have to use any ND filters at all, and I was able to shoot with my particular flash and softbox and camera combination. It'll depend what brand of flash you use. You might have to tweak this. I was getting up to about 4,000th of a second without having to do anything fancy. I don't have to trick anything. I don't have to time anything. It just works great, and that's no ND filters required. Very nice. As I go even faster into my shutter speeds, yes, I have to now start worrying about losing maybe too much flash output, having to tweak that timing to get everything to match up. But I still feel like if you're willing to put in the work, you get something unique out of this camera. Okay, so I hope that all made sense, guys. Now we're going to go to Jordan because you can talk about video because there's a lot of stuff to talk about that with the A9 III as well. But in a very jarring move, we were actually in California just last week and Jordan got to do his samples in California, the lucky guy, where it's beautiful and warm. So enjoy that respite. We did get him back though because he had to stand out there while we took those portraits.
All right, it's Jordan to talk about the video capabilities of the A9 III, and for a little context, it is still an absolute frozen hellscape outside, so I am going to be filming this indoors. But I was able to use the A9 III as my primary video camera on a recent trip down to California. Now, at the Samsung event, I was hoping that there would be all kinds of strobes going off, but unfortunately, everyone's just using their cell phone, so I wasn't able to test flash banding for that, but I was able to see how it performs on a practical shoot. So there's a couple overall things that you need to know about the A9 III as a video camera. For starters, it has all of the latest advancements that Sony's made for recording videos. That means you're getting things like breathing compensation, a focus map, you're getting the amazing articulating screen that we'd seen before just on the A7R5 that is my favorite articulation for shooting video. This does introduce one new feature. We can record a 48th or 96th of a second if you're shooting at 24 frames, and this will really duplicate the sense of motion that we'd get on a proper cinema camera, but there's still no shutter angle for some weird reason. But the other thing you need to know is that, just like in stills, this global shutter does impact the dynamic range and low light performance of the sensor. Now, that doesn't mean that this is terrible, it just means it performs very much like a modern crop sensor camera. You can see here when I'm comparing the image from the A9 III to the Panasonic S5 IIX, both 24 megapixel full frame sensors, we are seeing quite a bit more noise in the A9 III image, and that is absolutely to be expected. But I really think this all needs to be put in context. I mean, exactly what full-frame global shutter cameras are we comparing this to? There aren't any. When we're looking at global shutter cameras, we're looking at Super 35 or smaller for all the competition, and this camera will outperform those. So yes, there are some penalties for putting a global shutter in a camera like this, but especially in terms of low light performance, this is the best you're going to see out of a global shutter camera. But what I really want to highlight is my experience when I was using this camera in California. Like, yes, I knew I wasn't going to get the absolute widest dynamic range, and in very low light situations I was going to get some noise in it. That is something I could anticipate going into it. But every other aspect of the camera I absolutely enjoyed. The handling is dramatically improved. The autofocus tracking is fantastic. The new stabilization mode, Dynamic Active, does incur an absolutely huge crop, but the results are very stable. I mean, this is the first time I'd say you can do a walk and talk shot comfortably without having to go back into Catalyst Browse software and add additional stabilization in post. And that's disregarding all the advantages that a global shutter actually brings. Even when I was just doing whip pans or shooting out the car window, there is a look to a global shutter that is just immediately very professional and very cinematic. So for me, the main takeaway of the A9 III is I do absolutely think there is a small group of photographers that this camera is going to be absolutely perfect for, but there is a much wider group of videographers that are going to be very excited by this camera, and I think it's an extremely versatile tool for them. So if you're looking for the look of a global shutter, if you're a filmmaker, if you're constantly shooting in areas where strobes are going off, if you're shooting live music, then this is absolutely one of the best video cameras currently on the market. Yes, it's expensive, but when you compare it to cinema cameras, it is still kind of a bargain. And none of those cinema cameras are going to give you that stabilization or the incredible autofocus, or honestly, the very small body, the viewfinder. I mean, there's so many great advantages to this camera over a cinema camera, and you're getting the best global shutter image quality currently available. So those are our impressions using the A9 III, and I've got to be honest, I loved using this camera. It is going to be an even colder and darker day when I have to send this camera back to Sony. But I want to hear from all of you. Are there any questions we didn't answer about the A9 III? How could you see using a global shutter in your own work? I would love to hear that. And we're going to be talking about this camera a lot in the future on our podcast. You should definitely check it out. You can watch it right here on the YouTube channel, or you can listen to it on all your favorite podcasting apps. Just search for the PetaPixel podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you all again with more on PetaPixel.